When I traveled to Greece this fall, one of our church members recommended I read the novel Circe by Madeline Miller and dive into the Greek mythology of gods and monsters. I was particularly excited in my Greece journey to visit the home of the monstrous Minotaur. On a visit to Crete's palace of Knossos, and I was ever so popular on my trip and here at home as I told everyone who asked me about Greece all about the Minotaur. Now, if your mother was not a librarian who raised you on the Greek myths, a Minotaur is a monster of Greek legend that lives in a labyrinth beneath the king of Minoa's castle. The Minotaur is the son of the king's wife and a sacred bull, making him a half-bull, half-man monster who eats children. Greek myths are a little scary. Now, the Minotaur is supposed to be a punishment for King Minos' betrayal of the sea god Poseidon, because Poseidon had gifted the king that sacred bull to use as a sacrifice to Poseidon. But the king's greed got the best of him, and he decided to keep the bull for himself and to trick the sea god with a regular sacrifice. Don't try to trick the gods, my friends. Adding hubris to his greed. And so Poseidon turned his gift into a curse, cursing the king's wife, Queen Pasiphae, into developing a wild obsession with the bull. She lost her mind and eventually became pregnant with the Minotaur. Of course, in this story of gods and monsters, King Minos is wily and creative. You don't tussle with the gods without a little creative cunning. And so he had his craftsmen design a labyrinth to contain that Minotaur, and every year he demanded that the rival city of Athens send 7 young people to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. Eventually, Athenian hero Theseus falls in love with King Minos' daughter Ariadne, volunteers to go and fight the Minotaur, and eventually kills him and frees the Athenian people from the annual sacrifice of children. And you thought your courtship was challenging. On the day of my journey to the Knossos Palace, I woke up chanting, "Minotaur! Minotaur! Minotaur!" On the actual tour, our guide was very knowledgeable. Born and raised in Crete, she knew the history of the palace and all the legend and of Greece itself. She told us that in 5th century Crete, when the palace was alive and working, there was no death penalty, despite the myth of the Minotaur, and that instead things were settled at that time with monetary compensation. She also told us that women could marry whomever they chose to marry in the 5th century, and they could get divorced if they chose to. They could take with them anything that they contributed to the marriage. Scholars believe that this practice survived from a matriarchal Minoan society. 1,500 years ago, Minoans believed in a great mother deity. And at that time, female deities outnumbered male deities. Our guide pointed out different places in the castle that had stone figures of various goddesses. There were also murals on the walls of the palace, leaping dolphins in the queen's quarters and a charging bull in the great hall. There was a beautiful piece depicting acrobats leaping over a bull, which was a sport in Minoan society. It was called bull leaping. All of these real and true historical facts were relayed to me in this palace, and yet, friends, all I wanted was a Minotaur. I looked around every next corner to find the great minotaur. Oh, maybe the leaping over the bull, they're leaping over minotaurs. Or the bull tapestry, it's a minotaur. You can't see its body, maybe it's human. Dear ones, fear not for your senior minister's sanity. I do know that there are no such things as minotaurs, and yet, since I was a child, I had known this story, this ancient story of gods and monsters, of betrayal and power, love and greed, human error and capricious gods. I'm in relationship with that story, and when I was in the palace, I wanted to touch it. I wanted to stand in the place of its power and feel its pulse. I wanted to connect with the myths of my childhood and my imaginings, and in some way to touch my own history through the history of the whole that I was walking through. There's a magical dance that happens in the center of the flower of a big story, a way that consciousness vibrates out of it and through one's own history and the history of the world. We ourselves live in and through big stories, and they live in and through us. The big stories of culture, the whys and the hows and the who we are, they are not a fact-based report. They are not archaeological evidence of female deities or a leaping bull tapestry, but they are the consciousness in which we swim. We are within those stories, and they are within us. There is a larger map of consciousness through the big stories we tell, in which we get to move as a character in a world that's built by all of us. These stories, these meta-narratives, the mythologies that we swim through, they have power. They invite us in, they move us and challenge us and ask us to make sense of the world. As human beings, we organize our understandings through narrative. Stories are a key that unlocks many, many doors of meaning. These big stories, the stories of gods and monsters, myths and theologies, they're part of a meta-narrative that we inherit from our culture. Being fluent in these various narratives, whether it's through video games or through church or through television or your local library, being fluent in these narratives gives us access to the shaping and transforming power of culture and story. Access to these stories also gives us access to ourselves as we make meaning of the stories throughout our lives. A story can be a wormhole into the past, a way to travel through your own consciousness to your childhood brain and wander around there, knowing your younger self and how you've changed since those stories were first told to you. It is possible to make new meaning of old stories and thereby heal old wounds, changing perception of the world and of oneself in that world. In biblical hermeneutics, there is a practice that is called reading against the grain. What that means is reading a story as much for what is not there as for what is there. It's understanding the craft of the story and what the story is doing. For instance, feminist biblical scholars have noticed absences and suppressions that indicate larger stories of goddess worship in biblical times. The Asherah and its worship is repeatedly outlawed in the Hebrew Bible, but without any context. No one says, what is an Asherah? They just say, don't worship it. Throw out those Asherah. So scholars went looking for Asherah in other contexts, and they found a significant amount of textual and archaeological evidence that Asherah was a Hebrew goddess and was commonplace in biblical times in homes and altars. There are many ways to read stories to make sense of the larger narratives in which we swim. In Unitarian Universalism, we don't have a creed. We don't have a normative story about who or what God is or is not. Instead, we have a shared set of values that we practice together, from honoring the inherent worth and dignity of every human being through a practice of justice and equity, to honoring the interdependent web of all existence through the practice of protecting it. When it comes to God, or the holy, or the interdependent web of all existence, or the universe, or the human spirit, that God of many names, beautiful and good, and also beyond all naming. As Unitarian Universalists, we get to be in relationship with the larger mystery as we understand it. Collectively, however, as a people, our relationship status with that larger mystery might most easily be described as, it's complicated. As you use making meaning together, we do what we need to do to understand stories in our context. We read stories against the grain if we need to do that. We go back to the rooms of our childhood brains and we rearrange as necessary. We reinterpret stories for our own health and healing, and the health and healing of those around us and the communities in which we live. French philosopher Paul Ricoeur called this complicated interpretive relationship with the big stories second naivete. In his book, The Symbolism of Evil, Ricoeur articulates the stages of faith as developmental, and that we move through these stages of faith both as individuals and as communities and societies. The first stage of faith development, or first naivete, involves us taking the myths, the big stories, as literal. It's exactly as it happened in the story. Queen Pasiphae, she gave birth to a half-man, half-bull. It was a minotaur. But after that stage of taking the myths literally comes what Ricoeur calls critical distance, a stage that's necessitated by the Enlightenment, by scientific discovery, by rationalism. In this stage of faith development, our rational minds look at these stories and they say, surely a woman did not give birth to a half-man, half-bull minotaur. Surely that is not exactly what happened, and our minds take distance from the story. The logical and scientific mind frees us from the literalist interpretations of myth, of the big stories. But there's even more to faith development. After the critical interpretation, critical distance phase, we have the opportunity to move into what Ricoeur calls second naivete, which is the mindset of the mystic, the explorer, the seeker. In this stage of second naivete, we know that those stories are not literal, but they're still useful. There's still ways that we human beings know ourselves and our communities and the world. When we tell these big stories, we relay and also discern shared ethics and morals, how to live in this world and relate to each other and the earth. In second naivete, there is curiosity. There is wonder. There is not knowing and exploration and the possibility for connection across difference. In second naivete, the holy wears a cloak painted in the colors of culture, a cloak that changes with and between and among us. These big stories about how the world works and who we are in it, they're resources. They're powerful tools for communication and transformation and meaning-making, both in our own brains and also in relationships, in the community and beyond. Now, this is true of the Greek myths, of the Minotaur and of the labyrinth of Pandora's box and the witch Circe. It's also true of the Celtic stories of the Holly King and the Oak King at equinox. It's true of Hebrew and Christian stories of Jonah and the whale and Jesus' birth. In Unitarian Universalism, we also learn from indigenous stories of the Spider Woman and the White Buffalo and Turtle Island, from Yoruba stories of Olorun and Olokun creating the earth with a snail shell filled with sand. There are so many big stories about the world and how it works and who we are as humanity living in it. There are truths that we look for in the stories that are beyond literal interpretation, truths about us and our relationships with each other and with the world and its gods and monsters. Next week, a new administration is going to be taking power here in the United States. And I know that many of us are holding our breath, waiting with worry about what comes next. For our trans and our immigrant beloveds in particular, we know that this is a scary time and that there are specific threats to Black people and queer people and people of color and people with disabilities and women. In this time of waiting, in this time of getting ready, we need to resource ourselves, to prepare to defend our people and our communities. That means doing what you need to do for yourself to fill up your cup right now, this week. Whether that's going for walks or doing your meditation or singing. But it also means collective practices. Because this struggle is not and will not be an individual struggle. It is collective. And so this is a time for us to put energy into our relationships, into our communities, to strengthen those things. So also make time to have tea with your neighbors, or go to church, or join an organization, or come with us on Saturday to the Milwaukee Marching Forward event, or MLK Jr. Sunday, also known as Inauguration Day. Come to one of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. events with your fellow church members. Do something that commits you to showing up in the communities in which you are embedded. Show up for yourself and also for your people. We are building right now. We are creating strength, filling up our cups and resources. This includes accessing our stories and telling them. Our personal stories, and also the big stories that are powerful tools of meaning making. As progressive religious people, we should not abdicate these stories. We should not leave their power to the fundamentalists and the literalists. We are swimming in this water just like everyone else. So let us do our part and head towards loving shores rather than hateful ones. It is our work to situate ourselves in the stories, to do our healing work as needed, and then to use the stories at our disposal, the stories that are part of our culture, to communicate in the world, to communicate about ethics and morals and what love is and how it shows up. So tell your story and tell ours, and use the larger vibrating stories that our society accesses as tools to communicate about what matters and why it matters, about what is right and what is wrong and what love calls us to do right now. At the end of the book, Circe, the goddess and witch Circe, falls in love with a human. Circe has lived for eons. She has seen good and terrible people come and go. She helped her sister, Queen Pasiphae, survive giving birth to the Minotaur. And she challenged her father, the sun god Helios, to grant her her freedom. But in the end, the only thing that really mattered to Circe was love. For she had fallen in love not just with her person, but with people, with humanity. And Circe dreamed of becoming one of those people, of letting her body go as soft as her heart. She dreamed of shearing sheep and kneading bread, of sitting down at table with those that she loved and waking up in the morning just to do it all again. This goddess, she dreamed of growing old, of softening and rounding and eventually dying, not as a goddess making events happen isolated and alone in her remove from humanity, but as intertwined with her people, one of many, many, many of us making small choices every day for love. And so when this goddess made her last potion with an herb that transformed people into becoming what they truly are, Circe's prayer was not for power or riches, not for gods or monsters. Circe's prayer was simply to become human, to live and to love in her own small story as one thread woven into the larger tapestry of telling. We don't have to do it all, dear ones. We don't have to fix it or save this troubled world all alone. We only have to play our small part of the larger story, weave our song fiercely and fully with love into the larger tapestry of humanity. So may we circle around the fire and tell our stories together. Tell our individual stories of love, but also be part of telling our collective story as one that chooses love, chooses each other, chooses humanity, and every day, may we become more and more human by doing so. May it be so.